house was silent except for the low murmur of the TV in the background. Outside, the rain tapped against the windows, a steady rhythm that filled the emptiness of the night. I glanced at the clock, past 10. My husband was late again. No text, no call. By now I'd stopped expecting one. I sighed, stretching my legs across the couch, flipping through channels without really watching. The air in the house felt thick, stale. I reached for my phone, hesitated, then put it back down. What was the point? Then the doorbell rang. I froze. No one came by this late. Not without calling first. For a second I just sat there, heart picking up speed. I wasn't expecting a delivery. It couldn't be my husband, he had a key. I got up, crossing the room carefully, peeking through the peephole. And suddenly my breath caught. I hadn't seen him in years. I hesitated, fingers tightening around the door handle before I finally turned it. As I pulled it open, cold air rushed inside, and there he was, older, sharper, different. He stepped forward slightly, his gaze steady. His jaw was more defined, his shoulders broader. The boy I used to know was gone. This was someone else entirely. "Didn't think you'd answer," he said, his voice lower than I remembered. I swallowed, gripping the door. I almost didn't. A slow smirk played at the edge of his lips. The rain clung to his jacket, damp strands of hair falling slightly over his forehead. I should have asked why he was here, what he wanted. But instead I just stepped aside. And he walked in, bringing something with him that I wasn't ready for. We sat at the kitchen table, the dim light casting shadows against the walls as he spoke, his voice steady, calm, painting pictures of places I had never been. He told me about cities where the air smelled like the ocean, where the sunsets stretched endlessly over rooftops, where he had stood on mountaintops and felt like he could touch the sky. I listened, my fingers tracing the rim of my cup, realizing how small my world had become, how predictable, how carefully arranged. My life had once been full of color, full of possibility, but somewhere along the way I had let it shrink. I saw it in my reflection, in the way my hands stilled when he spoke, in the way my chest tightened when he looked at me. My best friend noticed it first. The way my eyes lingered on him a second too long, the way my voice softened when I said his name. She didn't ask, didn't press, but I saw the flicker of realization behind her careful expression. My husband barely noticed at all. He was always at work, always busy, always with something more important to do. Our conversations had become lists, errands, schedules, things that needed fixing. But with him words flowed easily. The messages started small, casual, light-hearted, nothing that could mean anything. Then they became something else, something I couldn't name, something that made my pulse quicken when I saw his name light up my phone. Our meetings were brief, always by chance, or at least that's what I told myself. It was harmless, innocent, just two people catching up, but deep down I knew better. The rain was steady, drumming against the awning of the small cafe as we stood outside, lingering when we should have left. The air smelled like wet pavement, like something unfinished, like a moment waiting to unfold. I told myself it was coincidence, that running into him again wasn't something I had hoped for, but the way he looked at me said otherwise. His jacket was damp, his hair slightly tousled, and when he spoke his voice was lower, more certain, more knowing than before. "You used to talk about leaving," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You wanted more than this." His words hit deeper than they should have, slicing through layers of choices I had buried long ago. I felt something shift, something that had been held back for too long. The wind picked up, pushing a strand of hair across my face, and before I could move, his fingers brushed it away. His touch was light, but the electricity was immediate, undeniable. My breath caught, the space between us suddenly too small. And then he kissed me. It was brief, unexpected, wrong. My body tensed before I pulled away, my heart slamming against my ribs. "No," I whispered, but the fire inside me told a different story. I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened under that cafe awning was a mistake, an impulse, a lapse in judgment that would never happen again. I went home determined, stepping into the house with a forced sense of certainty, convincing myself that I could erase it, that I could rewrite the script and play the role I was supposed to. I made dinner, lit candles, set the table as if romance could be scheduled, as if love could be revived through sheer effort. The kitchen smelled of roasted garlic and rosemary, a meal carefully chosen, a last attempt to feel something again. When my husband walked in, he looked surprised, maybe even guilty, as if he had forgotten some occasion, some reason why I had gone through all this trouble. "This looks nice," he said, setting down his briefcase, rubbing his eyes like he was already half asleep. He kissed my forehead, a touch so absent, so practiced it barely registered. We sat, we ate, we spoke in half sentences. His phone buzzed, his attention flickered elsewhere, his mind already gone. Later, when he finally crawled into bed beside me, he pulled me into his arms out of habit, not hunger, his breath even, his presence familiar but distant. I stared at the ceiling, at the shadows shifting in the dim light, at the phone on my nightstand with its unread messages. I didn't look at them. I didn't have to. I already knew who they were from. The restaurant buzzed with conversation, laughter bouncing off the walls, glasses clinking in celebration of something I wasn't really part of. My husband's hand rested on my knee, familiar, weightless, like an accessory worn for years. My best friend was there, along with old friends, faces I had known forever, people who saw me as I used to be, not as I was now. I smiled, I laughed in the right places, I nodded at stories I barely heard. But something was off, something restless curled in my stomach, something that made the air feel thick. I turned to my husband, watching the way he scrolled through his phone, barely engaged, barely here. I leaned in, pressing my lips to his, forcing a kiss, forcing something that should have been natural. His response was automatic, warm, practiced, familiar, but empty. No spark, no tension, no breath caught between us. When I pulled away, my eyes lifted, drawn by something unseen, something inevitable. Across the room he was there. He hadn't been before, but he was now, watching, his gaze steady, knowing. Heat rose to my cheeks, not from my husband's kiss, but from something far more dangerous. I had never felt more exposed. It wasn't planned, at least that's what I told myself. A coincidence, a twist of fate, an accident that shouldn't have happened but somehow did. The city was big enough for distance, yet here he was, leaning against his car outside a cafe as if he had been waiting, as if he knew I would be here. My breath caught, my pulse kicked up, my feet should have turned the other way, but they didn't. He saw me before I could decide, his expression unreadable, his body relaxed, but the air between us was anything but. I should have walked past, kept going, let it be another near miss, but instead I stopped. The space between us closed too fast, words didn't matter, logic didn't exist. His hand brushed my arm, light, fleeting, but my skin burned where he touched. And then it happened, no hesitation, no resistance, just a moment crashing into itself. When it ended, my world tilted, my breath uneven, my body torn between regret and craving. My chest tightened, my mind screamed, but it was too late. I had already stepped off the edge. Her eyes lingered too long. My best friend watched me differently now, tilting her head slightly, narrowing her gaze like she was piecing together a puzzle she didn't know was missing pieces. "You seem different," she said, her voice light but probing. I forced a laugh, deflecting, shifting, dodging, but her silence was heavier than her words. At home, my husband noticed too, though he didn't press, didn't accuse. He studied me from across the dinner table, brows drawn, concern laced in his voice. "You okay?" he asked, his fork hovering over his plate. "You've been distracted lately." I smiled, told him work had been busy, that I wasn't sleeping well, that everything was fine. He nodded, exhaling, letting it go, blaming it on exhaustion, stress, anything but the truth. But inside I was unraveling, slipping between guilt and hunger, caught between panic and pleasure. My phone vibrated, his name flashing across the screen, and my stomach twisted, not in dread but in longing. I should have ended it. I should have walked away. But every time I tried, something stronger pulled me back. And I knew I had already gone too far. The house buzzed with warmth, laughter, the hum of conversation blending with the clinking of glasses. The scent of grilled food filled the air as I moved through the kitchen, trying to keep my hands busy, my mind steady. Preparando una gran comida para la reunión familiar. I focused on the task at hand. My nephew stood beside me, eager, excited, insisting on taking over the burgers. Con sorprendente destreza, he worked quickly, flipping the patties with confidence, the biggest spatula pressing down as the aroma thickened in the room. I watched him with a soft smile, appreciating his enthusiasm, letting myself sink into the normalcy of the moment. But then in his excitement he turned too fast, reaching for the condiments, his arm catching my hair, pulling me back slightly. A laugh escaped before I could stop it, light, careless. "Careful," I teased, smoothing my hair. But the tension coiled inside me had nothing to do with the kitchen. Later, outside, the night was cool, the drinks stronger than they should have been. Laughter melted into softer murmurs, bodies shifting closer, barriers dissolving. I thought my husband had left. Farmers, bodies shifting closer, barriers dissolving. I thought my husband had left. Thought I was safe. But then hands found me, familiar but forbidden, a touch I had memorized in secret. My pulse quickened, logic dulled, and before I could think, his lips were on mine. It was deep, reckless, an unspoken agreement sealed in the space between us. Then, movement. A shift in the air. I opened my eyes, heart hammering, and my stomach dropped. He was standing there. My husband. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking, but his expression was louder than anything. No accusations. No yelling. Just the slow, sinking weight of realization. And in that moment I knew I had destroyed everything. He didn't yell. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his face unreadable, his eyes locked onto mine with something colder than anger. Silence stretched between us, thick, suffocating, heavier than any explosion of rage. When we got home, he didn't speak. He placed his keys on the counter, loosened his tie, and disappeared into the bedroom without a word. That was worse than shouting. I lay awake, waiting for something, anything, but all I got was the sound of his steady breathing, controlled, distant, as if I wasn't even there. The next day my best friend barely looked at me. He knew. I could see it in the way she held herself, in the way her usual warmth had turned to something cautious, something restrained. When I tried to talk, she only shook her head. I don't know who you are anymore. The words cut sharper than I expected. I needed clarity, needed something real, so I went to him. But when I stepped into his space, searching for familiarity, for comfort, he didn't offer either. His face was unreadable, his voice steady. That was a moment. And you ruined everything. The silence became a living thing, stretching between us, filling every room, every moment. My husband moved through the house like a ghost, his eyes never quite meeting mine, his words clipped, mechanical, necessary but empty. I didn't know what he was thinking. I didn't know if he was waiting for me to confess, to apologize, to beg. But he did nothing, and somehow that was worse. My best friend stopped answering my calls. When I saw her at the store, she barely acknowledged me, just a brief glance before turning away. He was done with me. I couldn't blame her. I went back to him, to the one who had made my world tilt,